Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Election Bites. Today is a big day for the presidential election process in the United States. It's the day that the electors meet. And so today we are going to be talking about the Electoral College a little bit, but really talking about Electoral College reform. And I am very glad to be joined today by Kevin Johnson. He is the founder and executive director of the Election Reformers Network, which is a research and advocacy nonprofit that brings sort of a global perspective to U.S. elections. He's also a member of the Carter Center's expert study team. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Avery. Great to be here.
So maybe for those that didn't have a chance to listen to our recent election bites on the final countdown, can you very briefly explain the Electoral College and why it exists?
Sure, thank you. So the Electoral College is the term for the meetings that are going on today in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, where officials are voting for who will be the president and vice president of the United States. And the Constitution says two key things about this. First, it gives each state a number of electors equal to the total of that state's representatives and senators in Congress, and that ends up giving greater influence to small states. And second, the Constitution leaves it entirely up to state legislatures to decide how they will appoint their electors. In terms of why it exists, the college was something of a last-minute compromise at the Constitutional Convention, and the idea was to have kind of a group of wise Americans that would be a buffer against popular passions and demagogues. In reality, the institution never worked as it was designed, and the founders actually, later in their life, when they saw how it actually worked, they all wanted to change it.
Interesting. I mean, I think it feels like every election cycle, it comes up, but it has been particularly relevant in a few recent elections where the candidate who maybe won the Electoral College vote did not won the most votes overall, did not win the popular vote. And so it seems like in those contexts, there is always a lot of talk about reforming the Electoral College. What are some of the arguments for and against reforming the Electoral College?
Well, Avery, there's so many arguments for reforming it. It's sometimes hard to know where to start. But I'm going to begin with kind of a new problem that's emerged this election, and that has to do with what we might call faithless legislatures. This has been the first election where there's been a concerted effort by political leaders to convince state legislatures to effectively override the popular vote in the state and to name a new slate of electors who would vote in the other direction. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, but state laws make it clear that it could, particularly in the scenario where a dispute lasted long enough. And then more generally, Constitution does not require that states actually use a popular election. Before this year, it was unimaginable that state legislatures would stop holding popular elections for president. But now, who knows? So one problem is that the system gives too much power to the party in control of different state legislatures. A second problem, which I mentioned before, is that the system gives unequal weight to voters in small states. A third problem is that there's a tiebreaker mechanism that might not break the tie. That's really undemocratic. But then the last problem is one I'll focus on because it's the most important, and that's winner take all. And winner take all is the system of giving all electors to the winner in the state, even if the results there were very close. And winner take all causes a number of really significant problems. One is that because of winner take all, only states that are close matter. No candidate is going to go to California or to Alabama to campaign because it's already clear who's going to win in those states. And as a result, we have an election that might be called a sort of swing state election. And swing state America does not represent real America, the rest of America. Swing state America is whiter, it's older. There's a lot more coal in swing state America than the rest of the country, which is why we've done a bad job responding to climate change. So that distortion has a huge impact every election. Another problem is the one that you mentioned, which is it is winner take all that creates the dynamic that allows for the second place candidate to win. A lot of people think Donald Trump won in 2016 because of small states. In fact, in 2016 and each of the last four elections, the 16 smallest states all divided 8-8. Instead, it is winner take all, and the ability of a second place candidate to eke out a small victory in a bunch of states that allows for that kind of inverted result. And then quickly, a third problem is what we might call the spoiler problem. And take 2016, the Green candidate in Jill Stein in Michigan, 1% of the vote to her probably swung 16 electoral votes from Hillary Clinton's column to Donald Trump's column. And the huge effort that goes on every cycle to keep strong independent candidates out of the election is the result. And that's something that reduces choice for voters, and it actually sort of blocks or impedes the maturation process or the evolution process of our political party system. So that's a lot of reasons why it's a good idea to change. I'll throw out I'll comment very quickly on a couple of reasons why, or arguments that are made for why we should keep the Electoral College. And the first is that most systems of reform propose a nationwide election in the sense of counting and adding up all the votes cast nationwide. And that kind of runs into problems in our context where every state makes its own electoral votes. And the votes and the laws around who can vote and under what circumstances vary state by state. So it's hard to add sort of apples to oranges there. So that's one problem. The second, there's often an argument made that the Electoral College is needed as a protection for small state rural America against large state urban America. I'm not going to say much about that point other than to say that there are a lot more rural voters in the large states of California and Texas than there are in the small states of Wyoming and Montana, say. So so the argument that this protects rural voters doesn't hold. And then there's also, of course, the question is, why should one category of voters, why are rural voters deserving of extra weight? What would be the basis for that? So I'll hand it back to you there to give you those arguments.
So some of your arguments for also quickly had the corollary sort of, or the opposite argument as well. It's you can make the argument both ways. Is some of your discussion about rural voters was making me wonder if reform of the Electoral College is a sort of partisan issue, or are there areas of agreement on reforms where folks from both sides of the political aisle can agree?
It's a great question. And there is a lot of partisan division on this. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the focus has been on the idea of a direct national popular vote of the president, which is something opposed by more than 2/3 of Republicans in public opinion polls. I think if there was more focus on fixing winner take all as the biggest problem to fix, and maybe keeping, say, the advantage for small states and the state-based election system, then there'd be a better chance of getting bipartisan support.
So what are some of the reform ideas that you find particularly interesting, or that you think might actually get some traction in the next several years?
Great. I'll mention two. One, quickly, there's an idea about expanding the House, which hasn't grown in 100 years. So it's way beyond its proportionate size with the population. Expanding the House would reduce the small state imbalance. And that could be done through congressional legislation. The bigger idea in my mind is to have an amendment that addresses the problem of too much power to state legislatures and at the same time ends winner take all. And this would be an amendment that fixes an allocation mechanism for electors based on proportional allocation. This is in each state, the candidates would receive a share of electors based on their share on the vote. So take Missouri, which has 10 electoral college votes. If you had a 60% to 40% result in Missouri, the electors in Missouri would be awarded 6-4. Even better, if we actually remove human electors, which we clearly don't need, their human discretion isn't even used. If we remove human electors and replace them with electoral college votes that can be expressed in decimal form, then back to Missouri, if we had a result of, say, 55% and 45%, then the winning side would get 5.5 electoral votes. The losing side would get 4.5 electoral votes. That change makes the whole country worth campaigning in, because there would be meaningful share of electoral votes available in every state. And at the same time, it would fundamentally prevent, or almost always prevent, the second place winner problem. And it keeps some of those structural issues that are preferred on the right that I mentioned before.
That's interesting. And so in that circumstance, that would require, though, a constitutional amendment.
Yes, it
And
would.
a state doing that at sort of a state by state level wouldn't really necessarily, there's no way you can do that at a state by state level.
States can, but the challenge is, would you have a California willing to do that and take away 20 odd electoral votes from the blue side? But it's interesting, you're in Georgia, and would a state like Georgia that has been through this kind of swing state hell, I imagine, where it's been so close, there's so much money, there's so much campaign noise. What if Georgia decided to go to a proportional allocation? It would likely be 8-8, right? Georgia's 16?
Yeah. Yes, Georgia's 16. It's 16.
16. And you could almost imagine the Republican-controlled legislature open to that idea, and it might actually take some of the partisan pressure off the state. So states can do a piece of that. For it to change the campaign nationally, though, you would need to have an amendment, and particularly one that the key thing is replacing human electors with votes that can be expressed in fraction, because then really every state is in the game. Otherwise, too many states, it wouldn't be worth the bang for the buck to go to the state and campaign.
Thanks, Kevin. This has been very informative, and
Fun to
lots of
talk
good
about.
food for thought as we sort of get beyond, hopefully, the actual election, and can start thinking about maybe the future of American democracies. Thank you so much for joining us. And to our Georgia viewers, just a reminder that today is the first day of early voting. So please, if you have not already done so and you're in Georgia and an eligible voter, please make your voices heard. And also to our viewers, please join us again later this week. We will be talking to Nathan Stock about polarization, dehumanization, and disinformation. That is on Thursday. Thank you so much.